information to you without the help of our sponsors. And one of our sponsors of our WITS event is TACG. And so for this next keynote that we're about to introduce, I'm going to have my friend, Director of Business Development, Keith Harvey from TACG, come on up and introduce our next keynote speaker.
Thank you, Kristen. Appreciate it. Good morning, everybody. I see everyone's getting settled back in from the break. Thank you. I'm, again, Director of Business Development with TACG. I'm also a long-time member of AFCEA, and as I call it, an emerged leader and a senior leader, whatever you want to call it. And I'm proud to be an AFCEA member. It's a great organization, and this is a wonderful event. I also am glad to be here and supporting WITS in this historic building. I've known the arcade a long time. It's great to see it renovated and looking so nice. Having said that, I'd like to, it's again my pleasure to introduce the next keynote speaker. First, I'm going to give you a little overview of TACG and the Copper River family of companies. TACG was founded right here in Dayton in 2006. Our roots are strong here in Dayton, and we do support and have supported Wright-Patterson Air Force Base for the last 17 years. In 2012, and I started in 2010, so I saw this transition. In 2012, we joined the Copper River family of companies. They're Alaskan tribally owned small disadvantaged businesses, which TACG now is a member of and has been since 2012. Our purpose is diversifying and facilitating the native village of EAC's economic development, land conservation, and the preservation of their native heritage in and around the Cordova, Alaska area. And if you've ever heard of Copper River salmon, that's where it comes from. It's delicious. Try it. We maintain a corporate headquarters in Anchorage, Alaska, with offices in Chantilly, Virginia, and right here in Dayton, Ohio. There are now 14 Copper River companies. TACG, I believe, was number 2, number 3. There are now 14 companies with over 500 employees across the U.S. and the globe. Combined, we provide a range of services and products to our clients, including the U.S. Air Force and AFMC. Now, enough about TACG and Copper River, right? I'm here to talk to you about our next keynote speaker on AFRL digital dominance, Ms. Alexis Bonnell. Ms. Bonnell is AFRL's CIO and Director of the Digital Capabilities Directorate. Ms. Bonnell is responsible for developing and executing the AFRL IT strategy, leading the strategic development of highly advanced next-generation technologies and platforms for AFRL. Her focus includes catalyzing the discovery, development, and integration of warfighting technologies for air, space, and cyberspace forces via digital capabilities, IT infrastructure, and technological innovation across the lab's operations and culture. She was one of the first employees of the Internet Trade Association, contributing to the early development and growth of the digital landscape. She served in challenging environments, including war zones with the United Nations to support over $1 billion of critical DoD operations in Afghanistan, Iraq, and many other operational theaters. She has contributed to the dual use of technology and innovation culture across the DoD innovation community. Prior to her current position, she was the emerging technology evangelist at Google, driving the use of emerging technologies to drive efficiency and innovation within government organizations. She co-founded the Global Development Lab, the premier innovation lab of the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. As she served as USAID's Chief Innovation Officer, receiving the first 10 out of 10 for innovation in the Results for America rankings. She was also named in the Fed 100 in 2020. So now it's my privilege and honor to introduce you to Ms. Alexis Bonnell.
Thanks so much. All right. Can you hear me okay? Good morning. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and be a little casual. I'm fighting a little frog, so if you indulge me by letting me take a sip here or there. But really, I want to have a dialogue. So I will take the opportunity this morning, introduce myself, to talk a little bit about what excites me, why I'm here, what I look forward to in the future, and working together with you. But most importantly, I would love to hear your questions, your points. So to step back, there's a PowerPoint I'm going to go through, but I think what's really important is to complement what General Richardson and others were sharing. Why are we here? What's different? And as was mentioned, I had a really unique opportunity to spend 3 years most recently at Google, so I have a deep understanding of what it is to be an industry partner, to be working with DoD, to be selling to government. But one of the best things I got to do was actually a lot of research around what was changing for us as leaders. And when I say leaders, I mean at every level. And one of the things that was really interesting about the research that I got to do was a really interesting recognition that we are in a fundamentally, dramatically different time. And I'll give you a couple of different examples of this from my research. The first is that the average change horizon, not only in DoD, but in government, generally, was historically about 5 to 15 years, right? So if you think about it, when a policy was introduced, a platform, a new type of work or service or weapon, typically from idea to kind of when that started to either hit its stride or sunset was 5 to 15 years. And so I want you to think about, as humans, right, as leaders, as people working through that age, that kind of 5 to 15-year horizon. What changed in the last 2 years, and it wasn't just COVID, it was also specifically some of the technologies that have really come into full use. So cloud, API, AI, other types of things. But what happened in the last 2 to 3 years is that change paradigm shifted from 5 to 15 years to 6 months to 1.2 years. I want you to think about that for a minute. And one of the ways that I think about that is, it's really interesting. Right now as a leader, I don't know how many of you will admit to feeling this way, but I know one of the things I observed as I was helping leaders around the world and around DoD in my previous role is that we were functioning from a state of kind of constant anxiety, right? That like the stakes, the tempo, everything felt a little bit different. And so I was trying to put my finger on where this anxiety was coming from. And so the first thing, if you think about that change paradigm, going from 5 to 15 to 6 months to 1.2, what that meant practically is as a leader, I am expected and I'm going to be making 5 times more decisions in the same amount of time. Think about what that means, right? What that feels like to be having to make, and if we put that in an adversarial context, right, where it's not only just those decisions, it's keeping up in an adversarial context, right, with that decision set. So think about that, 5 times more, that's minimum. 5 times more decisions in the same period of time. So that's meta factor number 1. Meta factor number 2 is about 90% of the world's data really came online in the last 3 years. So what does that mean? That means that not only am I supposed to be making decisions faster than ever, but I'm expected to do it with 1,000 to 100,000 times more information than I had before, while being an evidence-driven leader, making evidence-driven decisions, right? So it is not unusual, right? If we're in this role of trying to lead and understand and adapt and maintain dominance, to say, what does that look like? 5 times more decisions with more information than ever while being expected to be an evidence-driven leader. And in some cases, it's really not surprising why technologies like AI are coming up, right, with us in these moments. Because what should AI help us do? It should change our relationship with knowledge, right? Help us process, kind of act as our ally, a super processor, if you will, to help me process more information to make the right decisions. And so I highlight this because I think it's really important to step back and understand the context, not just as the technology, but as leaders, as people, and the culture, that it is that we're looking at when we think about these things. So if we step back and we think, okay, what then are the behaviors that as a great leader, I really want to see in my people that meet this technology moment, right? That meet this moment, where everything's a bit faster and everything is more full on. And if you think about it, for me, the way I answer that question is what I have to have and the behaviors of my teams is incredible amounts of exercised curiosity. Right? Because if I'm expected to adapt, to change more quickly than ever, and I'm expected to bring in more information than ever, what I really need is people who can function in incredible amounts of curiosity, right? What is next? What do we need to do, et cetera? Now, as a former, a very proud surviving bureaucrat in my former life, one of the things I realized is that oftentimes government's really good at beating the curiosity out of you. Right? It's probably really good and sometimes discouraging you to even work with us, right, as DOD or whatever, because it's hard, to be curious. It's hard to exercise that permeability to new things. And so part of what we have to realize, though, and come together, and why I love events like this and what DATF and others are doing is figuring out how are we permeable more quickly? How can we exercise curiosity, and how can we bring these things together? And there's a lot of things that we can do and that we will be doing that I'll share with you on that. But the other thing that I really want to highlight, and what I think is particularly powerful about our mission and what it is that we have the great privilege of doing at the Air Force Research Laboratory, and that is when you take those two things, when you take having to make decisions faster than ever, when you take a future horizon that is coming to you faster than ever, and you take that incredible amount of knowledge and information you have to harness, knowledge is really the business that we're in, right? So when we talk about technology, when we talk about this is all really about our relationship with knowledge, our use of knowledge, and how we're bringing that to command and to bring, to our adversarial opportunity. So I think that that's actually just really important to sit back and to anchor us. And one of the things that I really, remind my team on, and I don't know, is someone going to switch the slides for me when I say, okay, thumbs up. So first of all, does this make sense? Is this, this isn't unusual, right? But for me, it was really important to step back and actually have the empathy of what it is to be a human being right now in this age of adaptation, right? And when you think about it, I have a 24-year-old son, and when he asks me, what's the number one attribute that that employer is going to look for, or that I'm going to need, or when school districts come to me and say, what should our relationship with AI be? How do we keep our kids from using it, right, and cheating? And the reality is, this is an adaptive age. Right? We're in essence in an exponential age. And the question is, what is our relationship with that? So when we think about, how we think about that at AFRL, and I will tell you one of the things I think that surprised General Kane when we first met is, he said, it's nice to meet you, Alexis, tell me a bit about yourself and kind of this role. And I said, this role is absolutely terrifying. And he was like, did you just say that you're terrified of the job I have you in? And I said, yes, I am absolutely terrified. Why? Because this is a really hard time, right, to make decisions faster than ever, to be permeable to knowledge, to navigate culture, right? This is a really interesting challenge that we can't do alone. But the other thing I'm going to introduce for you, and I'm doing this hopefully in the idea of trying to drive a conversation, because I don't have all the answers, right? We're going to figure those out together. But one of the things I'm thinking about, and want to share with you because I'm really interested in your perspective is another thing that's really interesting about our relationship with knowledge right now is how we've exercised it in the past versus how we may exercise it now and in the future. And what I mean by that is when we look at most of our relationships with data, with knowledge, with systems, with platforms in government and technology, it's always been about control, right? How is it, and this is why, structured data, we want all of our data to be clean, perfect, structured, controlled, in the right place at the right time. And that made sense based on the technology, the platforms, the systems, and the ways that we worked as humans before. But it was also one of the things where we tended, in developing a platform and developing a technology and the desire to have control, what we tended to do is create platforms as kind of time capsules, right? So by the time we kind of got an idea, by the time we'd put something together, sometimes, I'm sure this didn't happen to any of you, but sometimes it felt like it was a legacy system before it even launched, right? Because it was developed to meet and to reflect a moment, and then the moment changed, right? And so this question for me around, all right, we have to have a relationship with structured information, with structured data. We do have to clean and parse data, but why? And I think, what this is really introducing for us and for me is, when we want to have really, really high confidence, then we understand where control of information is critical. But let's step back. We can also now have a relationship with information that is about curiosity, right? When we think about natural language processing, when we think about artificial intelligence, when we think about just being able to ask questions or pose issues and unlock incredible amounts of research, after action, things that are trapped in PDFs, right, that are so valuable, being able to bring those to the surface without having to perfectly control them, right, without having to map every single word. This is a new horizon of being able to be curious, right? This is a new horizon of unstructured information and unstructured knowledge. And what I want to be really transparent with you is like, wow, what an interesting time to be a CIO, right? Because how I would have solved these things 2 years ago in an era where kind of structured information was the dominant approach is different than the questions I'm asking myself now, right? And when we think about wanting to create a state where people can be curious, where they can ask questions, right? Where they can, maybe in some cases we don't have to have 100% confidence if we're asking a question about how might China do this with these factors, right? Maybe we just want to know some options. And so I'm introducing this because I think this dialogue around what our relationship with knowledge is in any given point in time and what it means to have a shared language to understand, are we talking about knowledge where we need to have a very precise, accurate, maybe it's your financial information. We want to get that audit right? We want to have a lot of confidence in that data. But if we're talking about a future what-if state, then we may want to really unlock an incredible amount of information that's out there. And all of this is just by way of introduction that, wow, what an interesting time, right, to be a human being. What an interesting time to be a leader, and what a challenging time for all of us to figure out what our role, right, in this type of mix is right now. What does that look like? So I'll walk you through a little bit about what we're thinking about, but I give you that because I think these conversations are really important, right? Because otherwise we can default into kind of our time capsule building when what we really need is like change engine building, right? How are we going to build something that instead of just asking and answering the near-term question or problem, actually allows me to ask, and answer questions that are maybe the 5th generation of that curiosity, right? The 10th generation of that curiosity. And how do we build these things in a way that are permeable? So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So obviously, Secretary Kendall put out the charge. And again, that race is faster. That race is faster than ever. And how do we meet that? Next slide. And when we step back, I think, it isn't just speed, for the warfighter relevance, it's to General Richardson's point of dominance. So what does it look like to be dominant? And, in essence, what we did is step back and say, okay, what is the 2030 strategy? What is our relationship to it? And digital transformation, and not just digital engineering, we need to do all of those things. But I want to step back for a minute and say what we also have to do. What I tended to see, and certainly was guilty of as a previous federal leader, but what I especially got to see kind of at that 50-yard line of what it is to be at a place like Google and to watch different entities, DoD or otherwise, kind of navigate this recent time, is that I see and I saw a lot of focus on doing, right? Doing differently. If we just have this thing, or if people just do this, it will be better. And what I think is really exciting about what we're getting to explore at AFRL and with other partners here in the room is actually technology is a thing we have a relationship with as people. And so what it means is that when we design transformation, it can't just be the doing differently, the simply using cloud and it will be solved, or API and it will be solved, or structuring my data and it will be solved. What we actually have to do is ask ourselves, how do we want people to think differently, and how do we want them to feel differently as part of this transformation? Because I'm sure many of you have seen the McKinsey and Deloitte and lots of other smart groups. The reality of why transformation doesn't stick has nothing to do with the doing, right? And everything about the thinking and the feeling. So when I look at this, I think we really want to ask ourselves, well, how do I make a more curious and proactive warfighter? How do I make a more nimble thing? And how do our collective values have to shift to empower that? Next slide. So the question is, of course, for the digital providers, how do you help give me capability that allows me to move this quickly and allows me to harness and have the relationship with knowledge that we need to have? And I think for researchers, how do we help, them leverage these capabilities and leverage these insights? Next slide. And there's a lot of things that make it really hard, right? So data, architecture, friction, complexity, transition, right? This is not an easy time. It's an exciting time, but not an easy time to be in this space. But one of the things I want to call out in particular, because I think it's really, it says a lot to me, and I think it really matters when we think about that people, that thinking and that feeling. So when we look at friction, I have a word that my team knows, they'll smile in the audience when I say this. I don't think about it just as friction, I think about it as toil. Because toil is all of the, I promised I wouldn't use bad words, is all of the crap that you have to do to navigate and exercise your sense of purpose and mission, right? And what was really interesting, previously I got to work with Space Force, and particularly in looking at different elements of culture. And I got to interview a lot of Guardians, and specifically I got to interview Guardians that unfortunately were choosing to leave and to go on to other careers. And one of the things that was really interesting is that all of the leadership assumed that the reason, especially in IT talent and digital talent, the reason why they were losing everyone was because, heck, they can make more at Google, right? They can go to the private sector. They have all these options. And they were right. They did have options because they were incredible, kind of talented folks. But when I got to sit down with them and I got to kind of interview them, there were three things that I looked at with them. The first was their sense of mastery, their sense of autonomy, and their sense of purpose. And I asked them, and I said, when you started, this role, when you kind of joined, when you were contributing, what was your sense of those three things, right? And what was interesting is mastery was about a 6 on average. And when they left, mastery was an 8, right? Which is really interesting. It tells us that they were learning valuable things and that they recognized their time, in DoD were giving them value and making them more valuable. So that was awesome. On autonomy, they started out with an 8, right? So again, realistic, like DoD, lots of incredible ways of being flexible and harnessing things, but also, there's a hierarchy, there's a way it works. And so, their autonomy score when they left, I think, was about a sense of a 6, right? Because sometimes in innovation, we tell people, go out there, break things, right? But then then it's not always as easy as we say. But the one I want you to pay attention to, and the one that really hit home for me about these things, was purpose. The average purpose score started out as a 9 or 10. Does anyone want to guess where the average purpose score was when we ended? 4, 2, 2, 2, right? What sucked the purpose from them was toil, right? You want me to use data, and yet you made it so hard for me to find it, or to access it, or to use it. And what was really interesting about our data landscape is if you think about it, and give me like a warning, because I'll just keep, babbling. Give me like 10 minutes, 5 minutes, whatever. Okay. What was really interesting about this is that if you think about our relationship with information, what we tend to do, because we value systems, right, and platforms, is that we often it's almost like we have a chessboard, and we distribute all the critical knowledge, and we kind of give out the pieces, right? So I give you the queen. You have this particularly really critical piece of knowledge, and I give you the bishop. Now, if this person wants the queen or the bishop, they got to come to you. And you might say, well, you can have the queen, but only if you do this, right, and then do this, and then do this, and then you can have the queen, right? But the bishop may have other rules, other types of ways of working. And so I point this out because, people really want to make a difference. Our mission is incredible, but we take very seriously at AFRL this question of how do we reduce toil? Because we know that by reducing toil, we actually increase purpose, we increase output, and we increase speed to mission. So all of these things are opportunities. All of these things are things we're focused on. But what I would share with you and encourage you to think about is please do not underestimate the impact of toil when it comes to actually achieving the state of knowledge, the state of curiosity, and all of those types of things that really matter when it comes to the thinking and the feeling and our connection to digital transformation. Next slide. So one of the ways we think about this is our acronym is MADE. Go ahead and advance. Model, analyze, decide, and execute. And what I want you to really pay attention to is the execute, right? Because we can model a lot of things, we can do and think about a lot of things, but unless we just start doing them and trying them and executing them, we really can't make things better. And so, part of my question is, how do I get to execution as quickly as possible, right? And it's not surprising, a lot of that comes down to, again, reducing toil. Next. So you want to know what is it that we're doing, what are we thinking about? If you look at the top 4, these are really the goals, right? So when someone says, what is it that you're trying to pull off? What is it you're trying to advance? Number 1, just faster research. Again, change horizon, compressed, we got to get this stuff done faster. The second, and this is a really critical one with that idea of leaders and leadership, better decisions, right? Everyone wants to feel like we're making the best decision we can make. So what does that mean as far as sharing knowledge, being permeable to knowledge, having the right information at the right time? The third is streamline transitions, right? So at a place like AFRL, we have to not only, participate and discover, but we also have to accelerate, right, and advance. And I want you to think about just the idea of discovery. So first of all, research, scientific discovery, in the movies, this is kind of how it goes. Lone hero researcher sitting in the corner, and all of a sudden like, Eureka! I've discovered, I've invented. Is that how this happens? No, right? It touches here. It touches here, these researchers, this university, right? It is an ecosystem. And this is one of the reasons why when I really think about how we contribute at AFRL, it's actually to stop thinking about ourselves as an organization and start thinking about ourselves as an organism, right? One that has to interact, that has to hit up, that has to, in essence, be in its environment. So this question of, when you think about the relationship with knowledge, I want you to think about those early researchers, right? So imagine, someone in academia, someone, from Boeing, someone from Google, someone from AFRL, right? We're exploring together. And what we're doing is we're creating knowledge, right? We're creating a new understanding, whether that's about a material, whether that's about something else. Then what happens? When we want to advance it, what we're really doing is saying what knowledge is still relevant and what knowledge do we complement it with now at 6.2. And then we're doing it again, right? So this question of having more intentionality in our relationship with knowledge so that all the way when I get to sustainment, I actually have the entire pedigree of knowledge that led us to that point, right? So this is a really interesting question, not just of structured information, but of unstructured. If I can get a show of hands and fingers again, I'll give you an illustrative example. I was talking to one of our partners, and I asked them, of all the information you have on this thing, that you support the Air Force with, what percentage of information do you give back to the Air Force? I want you to guess what the percentage was. What percentage of the total information, the total knowledge in your execution that you're learning on this do you actually give back to the Air Force? I guess 10, yeah. It was 11%. And I thought, okay, well, is that because of contractual issues, IP issues, you just want to get paid for it, all fair points. And they said, no, it's because the Air Force has a structured way of getting this information, and no one has mapped, the other 89% of information, so it just doesn't come into play, right? So imagine unstructured information, 89% of this incredible knowledge base going untapped because we want to have a controlled relationship with information versus an unstructured or curious relationship with information, right? So this is what is so exciting, is that actually all of that can be on the table now, but the question is, how do we do that together, right? How do we design to be in that state? And what you're seeing, finally, I mentioned low-friction business ops and toils, but a lot of the things we're looking at here is how we design that state and that relationship with knowledge. So, of course, data, modeling, this is lines of effort, modeling analysis, collaborative tools. We now have tools where allies, university, professors, that whole organism actually can work in documents, can share information real time. Infrastructure, we have sandboxes, rad labs, and places where we can quickly spin up, or ramp down different data experiments. Another thing we're really excited about is actually being able to take the query to the data and not only always take the data to the query, right? If you think about it, it's not unusual in my past life to have an organization that is literally paying and using the exact same data set 25 times in different things, right? Again, may not be bad, but it may be an easier or more optimized way to do that. Cybersecurity, human capital, architecture, and artificial intelligence. And again, I think artificial intelligence is such an interesting, meaty, amazing opportunity for us. But I will tell you that one of the things that's really interesting to me and where I hope to hear more from others is right now when we talk about AI, we talk a lot about our tool versus their tool, right? We gotta out-tool, we gotta have the better AI. But I want us to stop and think for a minute. When we think about AI, what is AI fed by? Data, knowledge, right? So I want us to think about the fact that if our adversaries have a Thanksgiving dinner table level spread of knowledge, right, and have brought all those things together, and if we find ourselves in certain categories functioning with an MRE by MRE distribution, our AI isn't even training or being nourished by the same level of insight, right? And so again, this relationship with knowledge, this idea of how we're permeable to structured, to unstructured, to all of that is a really critical factor. But what's interesting is that that's a culture question as much as it is a technology question, right? Because my pawn and my bishop and my queen have to actually see value and be incentivized in bringing that to bear, right? So that's a really interesting. So once if we took all of that great information and we made it available and our tools were being trained on that, what's the final bookend? What then matters is actually how curious people are with those tools, right? It's actually being able to say, are we asking more advanced, what if, more creative, more curious questions, right? And so this idea of curiosity as a muscle, right, as something that we exercise in our relationship with knowledge is a really completely new frontier. And one of the things that I will share with you is what's really interesting about this, as I was leading different groups through AI work, what tends to happen is the more senior, the more expert, the more a deep expert you are, interestingly, the harder or the more barriers to curiosity with unstructured data you have, right? Because you tend to have a relationship with the information that you think is valid, that you think is appropriate, that you think should be in the mix. And so what's really interesting is actually watching, as you start to allow people to be in a curious state, how hard it is to be curious. And I'll give you all an example of this. If you go to any of the generative AI tools right now, Bard, ChatGPT, any of those types of things, and you assign your team, let's say you take a team of 6 people, and you assign them, and I encourage you to do this and see the results and let me know, but assign them kind of a North Star. Say, be curious about this and agree on an output. And what's really interesting is to actually then see, without any other instruction, how people exercise their query, right? How specific are they? How flexible are they? How precise or defined? And I encourage us to do this because, again, this is a really interesting way of thinking about our talent differently, right? Thinking and understanding curiosity. But as a manager and as a leader, you see very quickly how someone's relationship with knowledge and curiosity functions with these tools. And again, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong, but there's an understanding and an interesting element of where we bind our curiosity as we look at this horizon of a new relationship with information. And so when we think about that, we think about these functional capabilities, these are really the types of things, each one of these is geared toward unlocking our relationship with knowledge, right? Advancing those things. Next slide. Again, lots of different things that we have to overcome in order to get there, and we've talked about why those matter and some of the different things that we're going to be looking at as a team. Next slide. And then finally, here's a little bit of, those of you, I know a lot of people like a rack and stack, so here's a little bit of how those efforts line up in the different areas. But I would love to just stop, questions, feedback, observations, like, let me hear from you, put me on the spot without getting me fired, that kind of thing. Any thoughts? Questions? Yeah. My queen is speaking.
Can you share, the Aerospace and Defense Center specifically has long-standing strong cultural, some may argue both barriers and opportunities. Can you share from your perspective, fully leveraging a digitally enabled DoD, what do you see as some of the lead? I think we all know a lot of the barriers, but I think there's also a lot of opportunities culturally within the DoD and the Air Force specifically. Can you talk a little bit to where you're seeing those?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think we have one of the most exciting kind of bridge generations ever coming into the space right now. But I'll give you 2 examples of cultural examples that I'm thinking about and that I've learned from as illustratives. So the first is a lot of times in IT, one of the things we do, not just in DoD, but in government, is we really set someone's identity with a platform or a system. And this really reinforces kingdoms. And so what I mean by that is if someone comes in, and I'm currently using Salesforce, Palantir, fill in the blank, that person's identity becomes very tied to that current state tool, right, or that current state process. And what that means is that I've tied their incentive structure to actually maintain that. What I've done instead, and what I'm looking at doing, even more here, is saying, let's actually back up from that. Instead of, thinking about your value based on your knowledge of this tool, if instead we align your identity with the fact that that information that you are the steward of is critical, and your incentive is actually to make that information as useful, robust, easy to find, et cetera, I've realigned that person's identity to actually be someone who's going to be looking for whatever unleashes that best, right? Versus whatever kind of maintains, my current identity. So I really do think this is the thinking and feeling. I really do think stepping back and asking ourselves, how are we letting and restricting someone's identity, and how do we incentivize that? But I'll give you a second example that I think is really powerful. I was talking to a particular general, none of them here, none of them in the area, and he was really frustrated by the current things that he was getting from their chief data officer. He said, the chief data officer isn't bringing me any new insights, and we've got all this pressure, and we've got to have new ideas. And I said, sir, can you bring the job description? So I brought in the job description, and I gave him a red pen and a green pen. And I said, can you please highlight in this job description all of the things about this chief data officer that are related to control, fear, security, and this relationship with information. And then with the green pen, can you highlight all of the things that are about new insights, catalytic, things like that. And I'd have you guess if there was more time, but you won't be surprised to know that 90% of the paper was red. Right? And so here we had a situation where we told someone, and we literally defined their role and put them in a value of almost kind of a fear and protection state, when what that leader really wanted was like new ideas, risk, curiosity, right? And so I think for us, this question, and it's not that, again, either one of those are wrong. They're both part of the mix. But I think being really intentional to say, what are the values and behaviors I want? And what does the digital tool, or the way I've outlined this, allow me to have a relationship with those, is just a fundamentally different and practical place. Like, definitely don't have all the answers, but what I tend to find is when I go to that individual level, right, and when I look at purpose, or I look at someone, and I kind of say, have I set this person up, right, to display the values, behaviors, and things in relationship to these technologies that I really want. And what I'm finding is there's a lot of opportunity, maybe to think about how we do that with more intention, especially as we're looking at a generation where purpose matters more than anything, right? So I have 5 minutes. I can take one other question. Come on, someone set me up for failure here.
How does procurement and sustainment of programs impact this? Because you're talking about explanations, but...
Absolutely. So I'm one of those people who thinks that procurement is actually super, super sexy. I mean, the reality is it's how government happens, right? It's how our mission happens. And so to this point of toil, right, to this point of how do we make that easier, I am certainly not going to speak, on behalf of our procurement experts, but I am really excited about what it might mean and what I'm seeing, right, on both sides of the equation when we think about how a new relationship with information may affect acquisition. So as an example, there's some great colleagues at CDAO and others who are doing really interesting things around generative AI, around looking, and one question might be, how often are we procuring something that is 100% novel and new, right? And the answer may be, in my research with, some of those folks and others, when I looked at how we might speed up the procurement process, in some cases, we were talking about an 8-month decrease in cycle time just because of being able to reuse information in a more dynamic way. But I think this is a really, really interesting opportunity on the partner, vendor, implementer side, right? And in fact, I think that some of the most interesting work is actually being done on that side. So without giving away names or giving away trade secrets, there's some really interesting work that particular people are doing on CPARs, right, and being able to look at their own performance. There's really, really interesting work, again, from the vendor side of what information do we have that no one's asked for, right, that isn't being brought to bear, that actually I can be using, generative AI or other types of tools to give us, a unique advantage and insight. And I think this question of it's not going to be one side or the other solving it, right? It's going to be both sides, in essence, saying, what does a new level and relationship of harnessing this knowledge, bringing it to bear more quickly, actually do in terms of helping us meet that adversarial and that speed timeline and horizon that we want to do. So my 2 cents is lean in. As you're learning, help us learn. Tell me what you're learning. Tell me how we should be learning, from you. But most importantly, being really permeable, in this area. The last thing I will say is I'm really excited. Our group is going to be, really trying to understand what's already out there, right? And I was actually talking to Kyle and to General Quigley and others. Is like, there's a lot of work around DoD to kind of understand what I'm calling, and I think Kyle, we have a different name, but a catalog, right, of services and support and things like that. My gut instinct is probably about 90 to 95% of what we need already exists, right? It's a question of bringing it in more effectively, more efficiently. And I think the hope is not only to understand what exists now, but more importantly, to make it even easier for us to be able to understand what exists that we haven't been exposed to yet, right, or been smart enough to bring in. So I'll just say a little bit of like a stay tuned on what that looks like and how that takes shape, but everyone here will have an opportunity, if they want to participate with that. And so we're really excited about how we will then be more permeable to new ideas. So I appreciate your time. I don't know if this was interesting. I'm again trying to figure out this gig, trying to get this right, trying to do well by an incredible mission. So happy to be here. Don't hold anything against me. I've been here for about 5 weeks, Latonya. 5 weeks, so we'll figure it out from there. But thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Bonnell. We really appreciate it. And again, she gets a copy of the Wright Brothers book. And I forgot to mention earlier, I'm also, on behalf of the chapter, in appreciation for all of our speakers, we're actually going to be making a donation on each speaker's behalf to the Fisher House. So that's the certificate that you see me putting in those books for each of our speakers. So, all right, it is break time. We got about 15 minutes on the schedule, so we will reconvene at 11:50. Please visit our sponsor booths on this side of the venue. Again, restrooms are located in the back. There's some drinks throughout, but network, chat amongst yourselves, and we'll be back at 11:50.